Thank you very much, everybody, for connecting with me tonight. I'm humbled and very grateful for this opportunity. I'm really excited, almost if I had all of you in front of me, despite being here in my home office in East London. I do feel the buzz and the energy, and trust me, I'm really, really excited. It's a great opportunity to be able to share my perspective working with data as a designer, communicating story in perhaps unconventional ways or less conventional, let's say. And I would like to share with you my experience as a data designer, as well as share with you what we can do when we visualize data. So before I go into the actual meat of what we do when we visualize data, seeing, sensing, and stimulating, I would like you to come with me on a journey. And we start this journey from this landmark, a site not far from the Royal Institution in the center of London. This is a water pump. It's actually not a real water pump. It's a replica of the original incriminated water pump that in 1854 caused a cholera outbreak, killing hundreds of people. So I'm taking you back in time to the 1800s. Cholera arrived in Britain, and this map shows the extent of the pandemic across the country. As we can see, the dark areas are cities, and they are the hardest hit. People wanted answer, and in the world of 1850s, cholera was believed to be spread by miasma, bad smelly air. Germs were not yet understood, and the sudden serious outbreak of cholera in Soho in London was obviously important, and people started to really pay attention and try to come up with answers. Some tried to get the best data communicated in the most compelling way to support those answers and to support the theory or the beliefs of the time. Here we're seeing William Farr, a statistician of the time. This shows how the outbreak, the blue line, peaked in the summer months. Hot weather equal smelly air, and therefore was kind of like a reinforcement for the miasma theory. But it was John Snow, no, not this John Snow, but this John Snow, a physician of the time, they came up with a unique approach. He conducted a lot of observation with patients for months, and he started to realize that perhaps the cause of the disease was linked with drinking polluted water. And why that? Because he noticed that all the victim actually did consume water from a specific well. And he did something rather special. He mapped the cases during the outbreak in Soho and the water pumps. And by seeing the locations of the deaths and the waters, we can see something quite interesting. So let's zoom in a bit more into this map. Each death is represented with a black line, and its place where the person lived. And the pumps are represented with a black circle that I'm highlighting here in blue, so they stand out a bit more. And we can clearly see a concentration of cholera victims around Broad Street water pump, right there in the center. You see that there are lots of black lines. But if we observe a bit more closely, into this map, we might see something isolated from the outbreak. The corner between New Street and Broad Street doesn't have any cases. So if we dig a bit more into this visualization, we actually read that there is a brewery in there. Well, none of the 70 people working or living in the brewery developed cholera, far different from the immediate neighborhood. And why is that? Well, John Snow actually observed that most of the people were either drinking water from a private well maintained by the brewery or just consuming beer. It's London after all. So anyway, to cut a long story short, although John Snow theory didn't or met some disbelief, he convinced the London authorities to turn off the pump by removing the handle. And this is why even the replica that is telling us about the story doesn't have a handle. And it resulted in immediate decline in the number of cases. Now, fast forward 170 years, skipping a couple of pandemics. Here we are again with COVID-19. And the virus has been detected in nearly every country, as this map shows. And as of this morning, those are the numbers. The virus is sickening almost 94 million people. And according to the World Health Organization, as of this morning, there were at least 2 million people that died globally because of the pandemic. So data and data visualization have become again key in trying to understand and provide answers to these complex dynamics. If we are Googling COVID, the first thing that we see before any written explanations are trends, charts, stats. And the range of visualization that we've seen in the past months is really unprecedented. Our social media and news feeds are inundated with infographics, infection heat maps, chart depicting transmission rates, death count, geographical spread, the impact of the lockdown, and now the vaccine count. We've seen an incredible effort from researchers, scientists, journalists, designers, really coming together to overcome the limits of the data. And those limits are due to the very challenge of quantifying this complex human experience. And we're using data to visualize the scale of the pandemic or to predict model and inform public policies and educate the public. And in this universe of COVID-related visualization, one that particularly stands out for me is this simple graph, a diagram flattening the curve. In my opinion, is a great example of how information design can really empower storytelling, can become a tool of communication. It has been so widely spread that it's become part of our vernacular. It's simple, both visually and verbally, and articulates so well why we need to take protective measures, because we want to spread the cases in order to protect the healthcare system. So if Snow's map is a great example of how data visualization can become a tool for problem solving to connect numbers, identify insights, and offer solutions, or in other words, to innovate, I believe that this second example, more modern, flattening the curve, is a great example of an information display that really can empower storytelling and can inform a wider audience. And I think that these are the two main purposes of why we represent data in a visual form. On one side is the problem solving, and on the other side is the communication. And the two purposes are interconnected. In fact, if we're thinking about problem solving, very often the main step of solving a problem is to all agree on the data, on the problem, on how to interrogate the data, and the representation of it in the way that we're communicating it is really crucial. So tonight we're going to be talking about data design, which sits at the intersection of these two disciplines, science and art. And I'm talking more broadly about data design and not just data visualization, because what I do when I design with data can really take different forms, from charts to infographics, interactive dashboards, or physical experiences. And the space that we work in is really connecting two human methods. So if science is our quintessential human method to try to manage and control the chaos of the world, I believe the art is our more emotional response to the chaos and uncertainty of the world. And the way that we join these two together when it comes to data design is through visual storytelling applied to data and statistics. And data becomes like the raw material to base our stories on. So how do we bridge these two together? Well, we take advantage of visual intelligence. We're all visual thinkers. which means that we have an innate ability to generate, store, retrieve, transform visual images and sensations. When we're looking at a bar chart, we're not looking at it just with our eyes, but we're looking at it with our brain. When visual information leaves the retina, it's sent to our brain, and there is processed. And we want to really engage our brain, both from a pre-attentive processing perspective, as well as an attentive method, which means the fast and the slow systems that our brain work with. So to go quite briefly on how visual perception work to illustrate those concepts, I would like you to take a look at this table, kind of like a simple sequence of numbers, but it's going to take us a few seconds to really understand the relationship between these numbers. And the reason is because we need to tap into our slow system, the analytical brain, to calculate the difference between the number and understand the relationship. However, if I'm showing you the same numbers in a visual form, in this case, a column chart, our brain is engaged in a fraction of a second. Our visual cortex can detect these patterns and see an increase, a decrease, and also the magnitude of these changes. It's pretty incredible. We are carrying with us this visual processor that is incredibly powerful, which is our visual cortex, and it's really, really fast. And even young children can see the difference in color, contrast, length, width in an effortless and subconscious way. And for the reason that a visualization is a powerful visual exercise, because it takes advantage of our pre-attentive processing. And knowing that we have those visual attributes that our brain can make sense of, then we can actually organize the data in a visual form so it communicates to our brain what we want to communicate, what we want our brain to see, by grouping things, by making things move, by making things larger, smaller. We can draw people's attention and we can create a visual hierarchy. What we see here is the list of all the pre-attentive visual attributes that our visual cortex is able to quickly spot. And the person that knew how important visual perception was this guy, William Playfair, who in his notes wrote, "No study is less alluring or more dry and tedious than statistics, unless the mind and imagination are set to work." You might wonder, who is William Playfair? Well, is regarded, among many other things, to be the father of these charting techniques, the line charts, the pie charts, and the bar charts. Conventions that we're using still nowadays after a few hundreds years. But visual intelligence can do much more. Before the invention of charting convention, we've made sense and tried to communicate the complexity of our world in a visual form. And therefore, we can actually take advantage of the meaning of images, the meaning that we have applied to symbols, to encode meaning in our stories. Data visualization is more than just representing numbers. Ultimately, it's about visualizing and telling stories. So we want to take advantage of our visual cortex in the way that it reads patterns, but also the way that we can read meaning into images. Millennium before written language, we have employed images to communicate. Think about cave painting, or the first properly coded written system, hieroglyphics, were pictograms. And this is not just innate to civilization, it's actually innate to each and one of us. As children, instinctively, we make sense of the world visually before we're able to communicate. And we can draw and encode what we see around us before we can write. These are the drawings in response to a project that I did a few years ago when I was investigating gender stereotypes in illustrated books for kids. And I did a bit of like field work with children and asked them to draw the concept of a man and a woman. And both kids here, a 3 and a 4-year-old, were able to articulate those abstract concepts in a visual way. So data visualization can really employ semiotics, which is the study of how we associate meaning or how we read meaning into symbols, colors, iconography. And we can take advantage of semiotics to encode our story. But we must draw an important observation here, that if our pre-attentive system can read these pre-attentive attributes, so these visual attributes, the way that we drew these 4 lines in a different way, in a universal way, when it comes to the meaning of symbols, especially of things that are far from what they represent because they've encoded some sort of meaning that we have learned, those are very much dependent on the society. So we are taught about these meanings, our conventional representation that we learn. And we need to be mindful of that and how we apply those conventions. So let's bridge these 2 ideas of how we can read visual patterns as well as make sense of visual metaphors to communicate data and stats. Let's look at a couple of examples. How much water on Earth is actually a really interesting data set. We read that 71% of Earth's surface is covered by water. So most of our planet is covered by water. However, only 1% is drinkable water. So stats are hard to read. The next step might be to put it in a visual form, like a chart, a pie chart. This is definitely a step further in the communication of the data. It helps, but we can do more. We can create an image that is truly worth 1,000 words. It's more memorable, more intuitive. It just becomes tangible. We can see the volume of the water. And even the 71%, so all the ocean, actually, when we're looking at the sphere, this droplet, in comparison to the volume of Earth, is actually not very big. And looking at the drinkable water is like, it really makes you pause and think, it's such a precious resource. Another great example here of an effective display of data that goes perhaps beyond a traditional statistical representation of climate is warming stripe. That represents the global temperature change from 1850 to 2019. Was created by Ed Hawkins, a climate scientist working at the University of Reading, who explored the visualization of the same data in many, many ways. And finally, in 2018 or 19, came up with this chart that it's been incredibly popular because it really engaged our visual cortex in an immediate way. Straight away, without the many details, we know what's going on. We can read time and we can read temperature and how the temperature is increasing. And chances are that you come across this visualization because it's been incredibly popular, from magazine's cover to even being used as a backdrop of a concert. And I would say that if people are even embracing it to a point that they wear it, it's done something really special. And well, if you're not into the dress type of data-driven product, then you can go online and you can find all sorts of gadgets or personal items with this visualization. Why so successful? Well, I believe that is because it moves away from the conventional data visualization language of this data. Here we're seeing a more conventional representation that perhaps provides more means for analysis, more details, but is definitely less compelling. Can you imagine this chart being used as a backdrop of a festival? Probably not. Warming stripes paints a picture, and it really borrows the language of art, of becoming more emotional, more intuitive, more human. And And in a way, similarly to color field painting that you're seeing here, it kind of like strips out all the distractions and uses only color to convey meaning. Now, let's move into my experience working as a data designer, so moving among these two disciplines of science and art. I would say that I wear different hats when I'm navigating the two. I'm the explorer when I'm trying to extract the story and see the insights of the data. And thinking about the purpose and the audience, I need to find a way to communicate these stories. And in the case, I become a guide where I want to create an effective display that connects the data, the stories, with my audience and really opens their minds to the message and reaches their heart. I'm a designer that works with data as a creative material. So I'm not that interested in the data per se, but I'm very interested in the stories that we can find in the data. And ultimately, data is not knowledge. It's all about how we interrogate it, what questions do we ask, and then the stories that we are representing and how we represent them. And it's a great space to be working on because I'm constantly learning about the world that we live in. Each data set presents a new challenge, and I do learn about different things. So with my book, The Infographic History of the World, I learned about the evolution of the world and the evolution of humankind. With this book, it was about the complexity of our brain, or perhaps the urban ecosystem that we live in, or racial discrimination and how it starts at birth, or tool that can allow us to prevent fraud or identify it at least. So I feel really fortunate to work in this space because I work as across many different fields, many different sectors, and also medium, from print to digital, as well as experiential. And I've been lucky enough to even bring data visualization inside live theater performances with large-scale projections to talk about climate change or data privacy. Tonight, I'm going to pick 3 projects, and I'm going to try to discuss with you what we can do when we visualize data. And I'm going to try to address this question with these 3 points. We try to make the data visible, and more than the data, the story is visible. And we want really people to feel the implication of this data with sensing. And ultimately, we want to simulate an action. We want to be part of a conversation. And to address these 3 points, I'm going to use 3 projects. And I'm going to take you a bit also on a journey of my career. And I hope there is going to be something of interest for everyone, because we're going to be talking about war, music, and social change. So let's start with the first point. We talked about how data visualization is taking advantage of our ability as visual creatures, our visual intelligence, and how we want our brain to connect with the data through our visual cortex in a very fast way, but then obviously tap into our rational brain to understand the implication of the data and what the stories mean. There are usually 2 steps when we visualize data. The first step is, well, gathering the data, of course, and then analyzing it and extracting the insights, understanding what is the data saying and what would be compelling for our audience to know. And then the second step is the rendering, when we create a visualization, and this visual display should really explain our insights and take our reader through a journey of discovery. I'm going to take an example from my book, The Infographic History of the World, to illustrate these 2 steps. And just a couple of words about the book. So this is a collaboration with data journalist James Bowie, and it was our attempt to narrate history in an unconventional way through 100 infographics. We looked at prehistory to the modern world. As you can see, there are 4 chapters, and they evolve in the look and feel to kind of mark the passing of time. All of this 100 infographic started with a simple question. And for the specific of the infographic that I'm going to be discussing with you tonight, the starting point was this. How do the world's conflicts compare? Quite a broad and generic question. We can address this in many ways. And data research led us to this data set, the Polynational War Memorial, a list of wars of the 20th and 21st century, in which we see the time, the regional distribution of the wars, as well as the cost, the battle deaths. At a glance, by putting actually a filter of looking the wars that claimed more than 10,000 lives, well, we're seeing the war as being a constant element of the century, with a staggering figure when it comes to the human sacrifice, 95 million deaths and 133 wars, just over 100 years. And that's really the story that I want to visualize. I want to visualize all the wars and the fact that, and the human sacrifice. So let's go back to the process. We need to see the data in order to extract the stories, and then we want to render it to attract our reader's attention and to explain the story. So step one, I need to put this data set into a visual form to engage my visual cortex and to be able to see and spot patterns. So I find a chart that allows me to plot all these different dimensions. I have time here in a conventional way represented horizontally. Then the cost of the war is the element that I really want to focus on, and therefore I use the pre-attentive attribute of size, which equal to magnitude in a very direct comparison, and therefore each bubble represents the conflict toll in terms of like the number of deaths. And then the position on the y-axis represents the duration of the conflict. So it's a simple scatter plot using bubbles, and our brain is engaged here because now we can finally see how these wars compare in the relationship across the century. We see two main conflicts on the first half of the century, and there are two outliers, I would say, in terms of the size. The Great War and the Second World War caused a lot of destruction, many deaths. But then in the second half of the century, you might notice that our density in terms of the bubbles is getting greater, and also their position according to the y-axis is getting higher. It means that there are more wars lasting longer. And there is an outlier in terms of the duration. One war that's been going on for 6 decades that is making my vertical axis really tall. And that's Israel and Palestine. So one more step in the processing, I try a log scale here because I want to spread out the range of duration between 1 and 15 years, where I have the most density. There are lots of bubbles overlapping, and then I just want to spread them to see them individually. But I know that by doing that, I'm skewing a straightforward representation. This is pretty much as far as I go in terms of like seeing the data in an exploratory manner to find the story. And to me, the story is really like, I want to visualize all of these wars, and the pattern, the fact that actually in the second half of the wars, we see more of them is very interesting. So we go into the second step when I'm thinking about how am I going to encode this data set to be part of a series of 100 infographics, and I can't create possibly 100 bar charts or 100 bubble charts. So I look for inspiration and I try to think deeply about what the data stands for. I usually find my inspiration or the references I use in science, nature, art, popular culture, I look elsewhere, not in the data viz field. First of all, because you want to do something unique, but second, because what you're representing is not data. So looking at data visualization doesn't usually help. What we really want to think is about the story that the data is narrating. And in this case, is in photography and popular culture that I find the inspiration. This field of poppies becomes a metaphor that I can use to encode my data. And when I see this image that recalls in my mind in Flanders films, I can click and I can join these two together because I know the shape of the data. I go back to the drawing board, and now I've got a new visual element that I didn't have on the scatter plot, is the stem. So I'm thinking, what if I use the stem to actually draw duration both horizontally on my timeline, but also vertically? In the case, I can actually overcome the skewing proportion of the duration if I use a log scale. And this is the final outcome, where we see that all the wars, each poppy represents one conflict, is anchored on the timeline by the stem, and it grows horizontally and vertically. And when it stops growing is when the war ends. And there we see the size, the toll of the conflict, the human sacrifice, with the symbol of commemoration that is the poppy. And I guess, like, even if you don't understand the poppy as a visual metaphor, because you might not be familiar with it, the book has been printed and distributed in different countries. It's still been a visualization that resonated because it borrows, I believe, the rhetorics that we use in poetry, like the oxymoron. That was the basic of in Flanders fields. There is a striking opposition of life and death that when you see this image, you kind of like stop. And there is a bit of dissonance, right, between the appearance and the content. It surprises you. It makes you pause. It makes you stop. It makes you take it in. So one more thing, actually, on this one. Due to the nature of the outcome, it needed to be contained in the sprite of the book. And I couldn't possibly label all the words. And that was kind of like a pity, because I did think that all the words needed to be labeled in a way, but it was practically impossible to fit all the labels. So a year after the book came out, to coincide with the centenary of the Great War, I decided to launch an interactive experience proposing the same visualization, but in an interactive form. I take the users through a brief introduction of the poppy being actually adopted after the Great War as a symbol of commemoration. In fact, the Great War was dubbed to be the war to end all wars. And then as a user, you're dropped into this interactive landscape that allows you to really dig into the data and to see different stories. With a more kind of like user-driven experience here, you can really see what you want and what will resonate with you, whether it's reading the data or the story attached to each individual poppy, or perhaps compare different regions. Here you see developed countries, Europe and North America on the right, and the rest of the world on the left. And I guess like this visualization went viral and resonated because, in my opinion, really bridged these two fields of science and art. So it still, in an accurate way, represents all the data in a kind of statistical form, but it really borrows the language of art to communicate and to create a deeper connection and a deeper meaning. And I believe that what it creates is really empathy. So it's not just about seeing with the eyes, seeing with your brain, with the mind, but really with the heart, to create a bridge into the stories that we're representing and making people feel the data and getting a bit closer to the data they were representing. So I would argue that in our process, when we are visualizing data, there are not just these two steps: processing, so analyzing the data, rendering, visualizing it, but there is the next step is really the experience, the sensing. When we're trying to visualize the data set, we might rush to just go into whatever is available to us because of the tool that we're using is giving us a pie chart or a bar chart. And that might be enough in terms of like rendering the data, but that doesn't mean that our job is complete. Because if our audience doesn't actually understand why one bar is longer than another, or why some things have drastically changed, increase or decrease, then we're not really communicating effectively the data in the story. So it's really important that we think about the experience. What are we trying to communicate? And are we doing everything that we can possibly do when we're rendering this data in a bar chart? Do we need more label? Do we need to change the color of one bar to really make sure that our readers are getting closer to the data and to the stories? And in a way, we want to strike the right chord and make people really feel the data. And when I'm talking about sensing, I'm not talking about touching in a literal sense, but really like making people sense the implications. And I do think that data visualization can offer a lens to experience the world in a different way. So oftentimes we think about this process in a linear way when we go from a spreadsheet into a visualization that, if it's done really well, can become an experience, a communicative experience. However, I would argue that data and the stories that we're representing, they're not contained in a spreadsheet. The data is just a placeholder for something else, for our world experiences, for our human experiences. So if we're thinking about data visualization as a tool, as a lens to see the world, then we can really adopt it as a way to extract meaning from any experience. So what if we start from an experience and we use data visualization to extract the data, to process it, and then to propose it and to offer a new snapshot and a new experience to have a deeper understanding of the starting point. So yeah, data is information that is found all around us, in where we go, what we consume, touch, watch, or hear. And design can become a tool to make the invisible visible, to render the unseen. So in the next project, I would like you to take you on a journey of what we hear, imagine, and feeling while we're listening to a song. And this project is called Auditives. It's a visual deconstruction of David Bowie's famous Space Oddity. It's a collaboration with a data researcher and musicologist, Miriam Quick. And it deconstructs this iconic piece of popular culture, Space Oddity, giving form to what we hear, imagine, and feel while we're listening to the song. And the genesis of this project was this question: what would music look like through the lens of data visualization? A bit of context. Why David Bowie? Why Space Oddity? Well, when the artist passed away, I was kind of like drawn to think about his work and the way that he inspired me. And I really wanted to use my craft, data visualization, to celebrate his work. So I reached out to Miriam, who I worked with, and I also knew that she had a PhD in music, so she would be the perfect expert to guide me through the data discovery. And together we embarked in this journey. They started with Space Oddity because it was the first masterpiece that really launched Bowie into international fame. And really, our ambition was, can we use data to understand better his craft and to come back to the original song with a deeper understanding, with more knowledge, if you want. So this song is spectacular, is rich in cultural connections, is about an astronaut, Major Tom, who goes into space and never comes back. Also bear in mind, when his release is 1969, man is just about to land on the moon. And it was not a surprise that the BBC refused to play it until the Apollo 11 astronauts had safely returned. Not just that, according to David Bowie himself, the true inspiration was seeing Kubrick's film 2001, A Space Odyssey. He actually watched the movie several times, and he said that he was stoned out of his mind, he was tripping when he came out with the first few lines of the lyrics. So I was extremely excited to actually dig into the song and see how Bowie pieced it together to become this beautiful experience. And Miriam really helped in terms of like bringing our expertise, our scientific approach to deconstruct the music. We collected data from a musical perspective, but also interpretative and emotional. So there was a lot of like listening to the song on repeat, and we're still not sick of it, which is obviously a really good sign. At the outset of the project, I tried to identify a way to create a system that allowed us to then codify all these insights that we were gathering. And the medium of the vinyl, or the LP, helped me to kind of like navigate the many choices that I needed to take. So if you're thinking about the vinyl and how it worked, obviously it was the way that the song was distributed when it was released. But if you're zooming in into the groove, those are actually data visualizations. They were just not designed or devised to be seen by our eyes, by our brain, but by the needles of the record player. So I thought, what if we could expand these grooves and show the different layers of data through data visualization or infographic storytelling? And I got really excited. So we tried different materials, and then we actually used acrylic to engrave the data visualization in these data sculptures that resemble the LP. Here you can see that the system is based on mostly on time. That becomes the connector between the time visualization. Time begins at 12 o'clock and it goes around the record. So this length of the song, one turn, one spin around the circumference. And each record contains one layer of our deconstruction, from the narrative to the texture, the rhythm, structure, the lyrics, melody, trip, and emotions. And I'm going to share a couple with you just to kind of like show you the type of stories that we found. So starting with the most obvious element, the narrative, we tracked Major Tom's trajectory from Earth. We're seeing here a very sober representation of where the two characters are. Ground control is next to the central label, and is depicting with solid white for when he's talking and shaded instrument for when he's when there is shaded lines for instrumental sections. While Major Tom is the spiraling line, and again there are the two vocals and instrumental sections. There are some kind of like dotted lines that connects the two, as you can see here, and those are the attempts to call each other. And we know the story because the two are talking. We know and we can track where Major Tom is because he's reporting back to ground control his distance and where he is. And the dialogue between the two characters is really the key element of the song. It reminds us of radio transmissions, and when dissecting actually the grammar of the dialogue is really informal, memorable. There is a lot of repetitions. Think about the tin can, the lift off, the countdown, short sentences, quite a lot of repetition. And it's almost like that we could be listening in on to kids on walkie-talkies. And I don't know, I didn't know this, but this song was written to be a duet. But in the end, Bowie performed both roles. Of course, he was an amazing performer. So he opposed a more low baritone pitch for ground control commands. And then Major Tom has a higher, wide-ranging melodies. And each instrument plays a role in narrating the story, and it really becomes like a balancing act between the more traditional orchestral instrument and the now vintage synthesizer. There is, when we're looking at all the instruments used, there is a tension between the past and the future. And when we're looking at the roles of these instruments, it's interesting to looking at the waveform of the various tracks that compose the song, because we can see some very interesting things. For instance, the strings are silent until the moment of countdown, and then there is a suspense that is built with the countdown, and then there is this beautiful crescendo that is mostly done through the strings that gets louder and louder. And we know that it's got like an emotional response, because in an empirical way, we did track how people felt and their emotional response during the song. So we interviewed 50 people, and we noticed that as they were listening to the song, their emotional response was peaking in the moment of liftoff. There are many more stories that we found during our deconstruction, and you can find those at auditvs.com, as well as like listening to the song with our visual deconstruction that is being animated throughout the song. So to wrap this this project, it took months of exploration and many hours of listening to the song on repeat. So definitely, as creators, we came back with it to the initial experience with a much deeper understanding of Bowie's craft. We were incredibly impressed and inspired. And really, in our exhibition, that was the outcome of this project, we invited the public to take this journey with us, to see the invisible and try to give form to the music, to come away with a deeper understanding of the song and the masterpiece. And if we're thinking about data visualization as a lens that allows us to process through the rendering of an experience and extract new data and then piece it back together to communicate a deeper experience, then we can really use it as a tool to understand the world that we live in, any experience, because we can actually extract data from anything. And in this process, I would say that we should add this third element. We're not just creating an experience when we're visualizing data, but we're trying to really create a shift. We want to stimulate a reaction, an action. We want to create a transformation. So tonight, I hope that you will want to listen to Space Oddity after my talk, and perhaps think about it and the stories that you've just heard through data visualization, and experience it in a new way. So how do we create this shift, and why is it important? Well, because it's an act of communication. We want to pique our audience curiosity, challenge their assumption, or simply be part of a conversation. But it's really important that we decide up front what is the type of communication that we're trying to engage our audience with. And I do believe that oftentimes when we're just rendering data and we publish it as a quick snapshot, and we think our job is done, we don't really think about the implication of this communication. We think, okay, I've done my job, I've created a bar chart here, it's rendered, it's done. But really what we're trying to do is communicating an important story with the bar chart. And the bar chart is not a conclusive answer. It's possibly just the best possible understanding that we have at the moment in time of the data set. So data visualization comes with a lot of arrogance, if you want, when it presents itself as a conclusive answer. And I do believe that what we do when we're creating these data snapshots, just a snapshot of the reality that we live in. So they should really be the beginning of a conversation. And I see data as a vehicle to explain our human experiences, even if it provides evidence of our theory and so forth. We should really engage in this act of communication with a broader perspective, and really thinking that the process that we've taken, where there was like the data collection, the way that we have analyzed it, the way that we have interrogated the data, capture our own bias, our own understanding of the subject, and how to frame it, how we encode it, how we visualize it. Obviously, they're all decisions that the creators take, and they come with limitations, right, in totally representing the full complexity of the world. So I would like us to think about really the limitation of what we do when we're visualizing data and portraying the world that we live in. As the Belgian surrealist René Magritte made us rethink about our ability to truly capture reality with this painting, by drawing or by painting a pipe and saying this is not a pipe. I do believe that in data visualization, we should also really think harder about our ability to really capture the full complexity. And this is the premises of the next project. The premise is really a limitation, the sober reality of the limitation of the data that we had to fully capture the extent and the depth of the Me Too movement. So we use data visualization in this case to address this question: can social media become a vehicle to foster social change and help reshape traditional views, to create an impression of the shared experience with the hashtag #MeToo. The project is called MeToomentum, and again is a collaboration, this time with Lucia Konchinkova. And in address this question of like capturing if social media can actually become a catalyst for social change by looking at a limited amount of data. So in our corpus, as we scraped the API of Twitter, we had about 200,000 tweets after cleaning the data set, which in the full scale of what the Me Too movement has been was a drop in the ocean. Obviously, the Me Too movement has been going on for many years. It was just on social media that it became this powerful international voice that shed a light on the magnitude of the problem. But yeah, it's got like deep roots, and Twitter was only actually one of the many challenges that those voices took hold. But we decided to focus on Twitter because it's where, at the end of 2017, revelation of the scope of Weinstein wrong action really took hold. In response to this tweet by Alisa Milano, many people came forward in an act of protest and really to create change. So we looked at the API and we extracted all these personal stories. And after we had the data, we had a completely blank and a creative block where it was paralyzing looking at these stories. And I was really trying to find a way to unlock the creative process. And here, art really helped me to overcome all these limitations and to also maybe release a bit the weight of the data. So I borrowed the symbol of the dandelion that we find again in popular culture, carrying different meanings. It's often used as a symbol of hope. We blow it and we wish for something to change. And it also captures, in my opinion, these two characteristics of the Me Too movement: is fragility when it comes to the individual voices or the individual stories, but is strength when it comes to all these voices together. And I saw in this visual metaphor potential to paint a picture of the data. So when it came to interrogating the data, I used this metaphor and thinking about how those voices are connected, and really thinking about the science of the dandelion, right? When is in its seeds form, it's got all these points are connected with lines. And I thought, how could I use those to explore different angles of the data set? And we came out with 3 snapshots. The first one, spreading, looks into the geographical footprint of the movement. Then we look into the themes, so the most popular words that are associated with the hashtag #MeToo. And then finally, the third snapshot is about the most popular tweets and looking at these trending voices. So starting with the analyzing the geographical footprint, it's not a surprise that most of the tweets are in North America, in the States. First of all, we're actually just scraping the English hashtag, and the #MeToo is being translated in many different languages, but also for the first 6 months of the conversation, most of it was in the US. However, it truly reached everywhere, many countries around the world. So we thought, what could we look in terms of just interesting story? So we plotted the number of tweets, so tweet count, but more interestingly, we thought there was the tweet popularity. So how many times those tweets were retweeted or shared? And we see they actually in many regions where maybe there weren't that many voices, those voices were really heard. Like in Bangladesh, for instance, really sticks out. The second infographic offers a summary of what themes were contained in our data set. We extracted the most frequent terms and we clustered them and colored them by the theme. The center is clearly rooted by violence, sexual harassment, but we also see accusation and solidarity, call to actions, and many of these words will resonate with shock when we're seeing the perpetrators and the victims, as well as like where the violence took place. And finally, the third snapshot is about looking at who were the key voices. And by looking at just the most popular tweets, the one that had more than 1,000 of retweets, we extracted 1,500 tweets and we plotted them all on some sort of timeline. And the seeds that stick out the most are the ones that were retweeted thousands and thousands of times. But it's interesting to note the correlation between the size of the seed that represents the number of followers and the distance from the center. So the bigger the seed, the more followers the tweeter had at the time of tweeting. And when we're zooming in, we actually see that those tweets, they're really going far. They resonated a lot. They were shared a lot. Are a mix. Like some are obviously popular people, but others are just common people that were sharing personal stories, interesting point of view, or just being part of this important conversation to challenge the status quo and to be part of it. The visualization is available at metoomentum.com, and you can explore all the tweets as well as like looking at a timeline and how the movement has evolved. So to bring it to a close and to recap, I hope that the next time you're looking at a spreadsheet, you will feel inspired rather than overwhelmed by the data, and think about the way you're presenting data is much more than creating an accurate chart. We want to engage people in an act of communication when we want them to see the insights, understand the story, and feel the implication of the story, and stimulate a response. And design, I believe, is one of the best tools that we have for making information useful, not just presenting it visually, but giving people ways to work, think, and respond to it. And we can take people closer to understand the world we live in if our act of communication is well designed. And in that, obviously, comes a huge responsibility. As creators, we must understand that we have the power to influence or shape how people understand the world around us through data visualization, understand that there is a bias in the process and we can't remove ourselves as creators. And we do decide what stories matter and what stories needs to be represented and how. So I think that if we adopt an approach that is collaborative in nature between disciplines, we've got a really powerful tool, data design, that can link and marry science and art, data and visual communication. And the two can come together to create meaningful and more human outcomes. We should focus on dialogue among disciplines and embrace what makes art so special. I believe it's his ability to make people stop, think, and also is inquisitive and critical. And we need a lot of that, especially right now that we're facing so many large-scale societal, ecological, technological transformation. We really need a more humanistic approach, a multiple perspective into statistics in order to truly unleash the potential of data. So I like to close with an observation. Data visualization is certainly a snapshot of a complex world, but it's powerful because it can take us a step closer to understand the world we live in. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. It's been a long time since a Tuesday night has felt this special. Thank you.